Greetings and welcome to the Department of Tangents podcast, a conversation with writer Pornsak Pichetshote and artist Aaron Campbell of the graphic novel Infidel, with new music from Landroid. I'm your host, Nick Zeno. Pornsak Pichetshote edited other people's books for DC for years before he attempted to write his own. He didn't give himself an easy out. His first series, now collected as a graphic novel, is Infidel, a horror story that explores xenophobia. It's hard enough to do horror and politics well separately without trying to combine them in a graphic format, but Infidel is a complex and nuanced book that grounds its truly terrifying ghost story in a very real world. What really brings these elements together is the collaboration between Pichetshote and artist Aaron Campbell, whose imagery and inventive approach is the perfect complement to the story. The characters in Infidel are not simple caricatures of racists. Pichetshote set the story in New York to put it in a more liberal environment politically. The setting is an apartment building in the aftermath of a bombing where distrust is running high. Aisha, a Muslim woman living in the building, is living not only with that xenophobia, but a more supernatural menace as well. Her boyfriend's mother, Leslie, who didn't like her at first, seems to welcome her now and tries to comfort her, but her boyfriend Tom is cutting his mother less slack than Aisha. Aisha's best friend, Medina, was also raised Muslim, but the two share different views on their faith. The supernatural element parallels the xenophobic threat, and together they make for a socially pointed story that is also truly scary. Pichetshote and Campbell address their collaboration and how they put these different elements together in the conversation, and we also get a bit of news about the new Hellblazer, which Campbell is illustrating. He gives us a bit of insight about the upcoming book and how DC is bringing John Constantine back to his roots toward the end of the conversation. Pichetshote also worked on two-sentence horror stories for the CW, which is new in August on their streaming service, and some comic stuff that he was unable to get specific about just yet, so watch for that. Stick around after the conversation for new music from Landroid from their upcoming album Imperial Dunes. And now, Pornsak Pichetshote and Aaron Campbell. So for people who haven't read Infidel yet, what is your synopsis of it? I didn't want to presume and give my own necessarily.
Well, I know one of the things I always say, it's about Pakistani American Muslim woman and her multiracial neighbors who discover they live in a building that's haunted by creatures that feed off xenophobia. And that's sort of my quick elevator pitch.
Mm-hmm. And these creatures, are they demons? Are they, is it jinn? Is that the way I don't know. I've never heard anybody actually say the word, so I don't know if it's jinn or jinn.
I believe you say it jinn.
Okay.
You know what? Yeah. I try to keep it vague, in terms of what it is. I mean, ultimately, it's a haunted house story. Now, whether or not it's meant to be sort of a new take, or a more contemporary take, interpretation of a haunted house story. But in terms of what exactly they are, while I think me and Aaron sort of have a good sense of like what we want them to be, I actually like the idea of letting the audience sort of like come to that as they're reading it. Primarily because what I found with this sort of stuff is that when you part of being scared is not having labels, is part of the unknown, and so the book goes, like, never in the book is the word ghost used. Mm-hmm. And there's something, even invoking the world, it gives you a little bit of comfort because you have a language that wraps your head around it. So I've always liked to, in stuff like this, be vague about the actual terminology, because I feel like it helps the experience.
Well, Aaron, what are these to you? Do you have to be on the same page about what these creatures are to make this story work?
No, in the beginning, I wasn't even sort of considering any kind of, canon myth from anywhere. We were just kind of basing our ideas on this notion of what we wanted them to, how we wanted them to function in the story, what their purpose was supposed to be. It was sort of a happy accident, an incredibly synchronistic happy accident, that so much of the way that I ended up designing the ghosts and the way they function is really similar to the jinn or Ifrit myth. in India, Pakistan, Middle East, in those cultures, the way that jinns function is so similar to the way that we ended up sort of designing the way that the ghost would function. So for us, it was always about keeping them mysterious, and even like the rules that we ended up creating for them were never expressed in the book itself. It was more for our own purposes of keeping things straight and making sure that the rules of horror, that we don't defy the rules of horror, which are, once you establish a way something functions, you can't just change it willy-nilly in order to keep consistency, in order to build the scares and to be able to function, mechanically going forward. So from the beginning, it was really more about what we wanted to do with the story, if that makes sense.
And that's a really good point. Me and Aaron, it was less about, in a weird way, me and Aaron didn't really go back and forth in terms of like what these things are, what these things call. Lord knows we had our shorthand, but for us, the rules were very important. And so, yes, even though we never expressed the rules in the book, that was very important to really nail down, like what this means and what that means, and when this can happen and when that can happen. If they can do this, they can't do that. That was super, super important.
Do you have rules that aren't in the book? Do you have things written down for what these I don't even know if creature is the right word, what these manifestations are? I'm trying to think.
Did we ever write? I mean, it might exist in like in an email somewhere. I don't like. I never sat down and wrote like a Bible for it. There might be little bits of it here and there, in the script, and then conversations with us. I actually don't know if there was ever a document that said, these are the rules.
I don't think so. I think it we developed it in our conversations, our many extensive conversations, and once we had that figured out, it wasn't really necessary to write it down because we understood it so, intimately by that point.
Yeah.
How they function, how they change and shift and react based on whatever given situation would occur.
And I know one rule was that it had to be scary. There is a political/social element to this, but it couldn't be just that. It had to be a legitimate horror comic.
Yeah, definitely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What I love about genre and genre audiences is that if you're working in genre, there's kind of like a responsibility right up front to entertain. There's a responsibility to be like, if this is horror, you got to scare me. If this is comedy, it's got to be funny and all that kind of stuff. And if you fall down on that, you kind of sort of let down the audience. You kind of betray the audience. It's one of the things I kind of love about genre. So like if if it wasn't scary, then this book would have just been some kind of like, I don't even know, like a treatise of some sort or something like that. And that was never the intention. Like, it would be a horror story with these elements infused in, which means both aspects of it had to work, which is why I'm so lucky to have a chance to work with Aaron, because you need an artist who can kind of do everything. You need an artist who can, show humanity and sympathy for the characters, but at the same time do sort of really scary stuff. And there's not a lot of those people that exist, which is why now that everyone in the world knows who Aaron, all the editors in the world know who Aaron is, I will never have a chance to work with him again because he gets like ongoing gigs.
Do you have plans to work together again after this? Is there another idea?
Aaron's schedule is quite intimidating.
Well, I mean, obviously, I'm wrapped up for now, but comics, is not it's not like you get a job and then that's your career for the next 35 years, unless you're Eric Larson,
Right.
So there's an end point for everything, and when that comes, absolutely, I'd love to work again. If we can figure out what the next project, whether if it's something that can follow directly Infidel, or if it's something completely new, but that is That is a big question mark, to tell you the truth.
And by the way, a lot of it comes to schedules too. Like I know Aaron was available for a while, and I wasn't available, and then I was available, and he's not available. So a lot of that's just like typical comics stuff too. Is that you get pulled in 8,000 directions, but eventually, like the desire between me and Aaron is definitely there to work together again, and then it's just a matter of like making our schedules work.
I had tried. I went in with the intention in this interview to avoid spoilers, but I don't think that's going to happen completely, because what I want to say here is there is something at the end of this book to build on for another series.
There is, and I think as I play around with ideas of what sequels, I have a couple ideas of what sequels could look like. I think they play off that, but hopefully not in the way people would think. But yes, it definitely implies, the ending definitely implies that there is a direction for stories to go beyond just the story of the characters in that particular book or volume.
Mm-hmm. So how did this idea start? Did you have a political or social message first, or did you start with the haunted house story and come to see it as a good vehicle for a more pointed story? Because you said this is an update of the traditional haunted house story.
Yeah, I think a lot of times for me, and I talk to other writers, and I don't feel like I'm alone. Is sometimes you'll have little ideas for things, but they don't really click until you have like these two ideas that kind of match together. That's definitely the case for me. Probably why, like, as I'm writing, the thing I always have to do most is simplify what I have. It always starts off too complicated. But so for me, it started. One piece of it was, I came up with the initial idea in like 2009. Obama had been president for a year. We had a black president, which means we licked racism. But Xenophobia was on the rampant rise, and no one was really talking about it. So it to me, it became this thing. I had this idea of, is there a story where we could link Islamophobia to this conversation about race, which at the time we weren't having. Now cut to now, where we're very much trying to have it on a nationwide level and stumbling on it. One step forward, one step back. And, so that was one piece of it. And the other piece of it was, realizing what I loved about horror was its surrealness, and when I realized that horror is just basically a reality, with a agenda in a way. The two ideas kind of came together, and I was just like, oh wow, I can't believe no one's done this before.
Yeah, this is the main innovation here, is to draw parallels between these demons, these apparitions, and racism. Only certain people can see them, and it isolates them from others. They look crazy when they try to explain it.
Yeah, and it was one of those cases, like nice cases where the tropes of the genre lent itself nicely to certain aspects of a conversation about race is really what it came down to. And so once you sort of saw the similarities, there was a lot to sort of play with, or how, I guess not similarities, but how you could use the tropes to parallel things that were happening in real life. That's part of the fun, I think, in the book. If you take a 1,000-step, aerial view of it.
Yeah, I mean, it surprises me that this idea had not already been done.
Yeah, totally.
Because as Pornsak is saying, the tropes of horror, especially the tropes of the ghost story, lend itself so well because at the center of the entity which is called ghost is an individual who is unable to let go of some burning thing from their life. And oftentimes, like in the tropes, it's just, lost love or, some kind of tragedy or, unfinished business. But the idea that hate could linger on, it's there. It's always been there. But it's weird that it was never targeted, the way that we ended up doing it at Infidel. Because it seems so it seems so obvious now that we've done it, like as an idea, you know?
Yeah.
I think that's what any innovation sort of seems like. After it's done, that's the best kind of thing. Afterwards, everybody says, well, why didn't this exist before?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think, too, there was a lot of ways this could have been the bad version of the book. And again, it's one of the reasons why I'm grateful for Aaron and Jose and Jeff, just sort of as a team. Especially Jose. Like one of the reasons why, like, I have so much respect for him. But also, there's this thing now, amongst comic creators of like, do you need an editor? Do you not need an editor? You just need your editor to like manage the project, kind of thing. But like, it was really important to me to have an editor, to have a creative editor, and one with an opinion and an outlook, just because it was so easy for something like this to go wrong. And Jose was great in making sure we did it, or saying like, hey, is this really what you want to say? And I don't know if I'm on board with this. Let's talk this through. And those conversations always ended up in a going deeper into the material, and the material always ended up stronger.
Mm-hmm. Well, you do say in the if you get the trade paperback version of the book, there is a discussion of how the cover art came to be and how, for that first issue, it really had to communicate so many ideas to an audience and make them pick up the book, and how there were 9 different versions of the cover at first.
Yeah.
There were like, I feel like there were like thousands of, like, when I look back.
Yeah, just the amount of sketches I did for different ideas, there were probably a dozen that we went through. So, yeah.
And to describe it, I'll post a photo of it on the blog post of this. But it's Aisha, the main character, sort of either turning towards or turning away from something, and behind her there is this sort of gnarled and twisted hand reaching for her.
Mm-hmm.
That's the cover.
Yeah. And
yeah.
Even
always in my.
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, in my head, I always imagined it as her sort of beginning to turn as she senses the presence of something sinister just beyond the veil, basically.
Mm.
Yeah. And I think that's and I think that definitely comes through in the product. But if you had the trade, too, that even once we had that, it still went through all these permutations. Like, what do we do with the arm? How do we make that arm work? And all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Well, because that's interesting. That was one of the things I wanted to say. In the different versions of the cover that are presented at the end of the trade paperback, the arm is sort of straight. It's just an arm with maybe some pointed fingers that are reaching for her. But the thing that communicated that this was horror and this was supernatural was a bend between the elbow and the wrist in the arm,
mm-hmm.
to make it dip down closer to her, to make it clear this wasn't a human arm.
Yeah. Yeah, the first, there's 2 hands. The first hand that I drew, I ended up completely getting rid of. It still exists in the original artwork, because the original artwork was a painting, so it wasn't something I could just go and wash away and change digitally. So I ended up doing a completely separate hand, which then I composited in Photoshop to get it more into the realm of the supernatural, the cosmic, and the terrible.
Mm-hmm. And there are some what I feel is like a historical allusions in the plot here. It's hard not to draw a parallel between there's an explosion in the building that was caused by some stuff in boxes by a tenant that everybody sort of distrusted. There was already some racism going on there, but after the explosion, several people in the apartment die, and there's a lot of distrust afterwards, and this story takes place in the wake of that, and it's hard not to see that explosion as sort of a stand-in for 9/11.
I think, definitely. Listen, I lived in New York, in September in 2001, and I would live. I moved there, I want to say in 2000, and I was there for 2011. So I was there for about 10, 12 years. And so the shadow of 9/11 is definitely, you know, that book is definitely in the shadow of 9/11. All the aspects of it. There's I don't know if I've ever mentioned even this before, but there's a mention where Leslie talks about what happened to her husband, and that is purposely phrased so that one could imply that maybe that was 9/11. But the shadow of it, much like in New York, the shadow of it kind of lingers on everything that's in the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I had, so Pornsak and I, we didn't know each other obviously, but both of us were living in New York when 9/11 happened. I had just started grad school at SVA, earlier that week, and I had only been in the city for maybe 2.5 weeks that I've been living there. So yeah, it was it was quite a terrifying event.
Yeah, it's funny, we never talked about this because, like, I was going to grad school around that time too, and I think I was there for like a month or 2 months before that happened. So we must have moved there like around the same time.
Yeah, right there at the end of the summer.
Yeah.
So we both have a pretty good understanding of, well, especially what it was like to be there right after it happened, and to feel that just a collective anxiety that existed throughout the entire city. And it was there, you know, it receded, you know, over the months, but I only lived in New York for 2 years. I left right after grad school ended. And, but you know, it was always that kind of buzz was always there the entire time I was in school, you know. So a lot of those anxieties, I think the two of us both infused. I infused it into the art. Pornsak infused it into the writing, you know, so that probably gives it gives it more verisimilitude as well, that we both were able to experience that aspect of the trauma.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's also a lot of subtle and unsubtle language. There's a lot of coded language in here, and a lot of the racism is expressed by characters who have just said they're not racist or decried political correctness in some way. The one scene that I'm thinking about is later in the book. You show a couple looking at the bills they can't pay, and their distrust of their neighbor sort of festers over that, and their frustration over their own circumstances.
Yeah. I mean, that, you know, that sort of stuff is always tricky because you know, it's funny. It was scenes like that, and I'll be honest, that for me, when I look back, that was some of the hardest scenes to do, is because as a writer, you always kind of want to find like a new take or a new sort of insight, and sometimes the world doesn't really help you with that. You know, sometimes the world, you know, a cigar is just a cigar kind of thing.
Right.
And so those scenes were actually really tricky. I mean, one of the reasons why the book is set in New York as opposed to anywhere else was, you know, it was too easy to do the Alabama set version of the story. You know, it was, I wanted to see what racism looked like and xenophobia looked like in liberal communities, and how it affects people who, you know, hate the word and try to disassociate with the word and doesn't see any of their actions with it. So all that I found to be a more interesting way of looking at it, and a more surprising way of looking at it. But sometimes, and listen, maybe it's because I didn't do the research, you know, that particular piece of research deep enough into the thing, or maybe I did and it just didn't go that far. But a lot of that sort of stuff, you know, a lot of it became frustration about. I don't think it is every single time in the history of America where there has been where xenophobia has spiked has always come with a recession, has always started with a recession or a lack of jobs. You know, it's really hard to find. It always starts with jobs, is what I've seen in my study of the history of America, and so that felt true, even though sometimes when I look back at it, it feels like it feels a little obvious. But at the same time, though, history shows that it's true. Mm-hmm. It's been true very often.
It's sort of hidden in plain sight here. There's another scene in which Medina confronts Medina is Aisha's best friend, confronts a neighbor, Haley, who has claimed to witness Aisha commit murder, and when she's accused of racism, Haley's response is, "When I saw your friend, I didn't treat her like a terrorist. Even after everything, I gave her the benefit of the doubt." And the translation of that was, "She was good, and look what happened."
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing I sort of really wanted to communicate, or I think that the space where the book really lives is this idea that we all know racism is bad, but yet we can't, but it's still confusing in terms of what is and what isn't racist. And so I think all the characters in the book are trying to, grope their way around the definition of that term and come to terms of what is and what isn't. But I think that in actuality, none of those characters, I would say that no two characters in the book will probably agree one-to-one on exactly what is and what isn't racist, which might also hold true for the world. Who knows? I mean, that's one of the questions the book asks.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the plot line, Aisha and Tom has a kid from a previous relationship, and Tom's mother, Leslie, at one point may or may not have, I don't know, do we know that she tried to get custody of the kid because they had an interracial relationship that she didn't approve of?
We don't know. I mean, like a lot in the book, there's not much that we know not much we know for a fact. We just sort of see the evidence of things. And so the evidence we see is that she didn't approve of Aisha for a while, and then she went and looked into getting custody of the kid. Now, whether or not it was a 3 a.m. panic attack and she kind of did it and she looked into it. I mean, she did go as far as to talk to a lawyer about it, so it was much more passive, or any of that stuff. We don't really know for sure. That's definitely one of those things of it's one of those things I hesitate to firmly state, because I think the audience's question of was Leslie, how racist was Leslie, was she racist, is she still racist, is part of the questions about the book. So the thematic questions that circle in the book. But what we definitely did know is that she looked into it. And for Tom anyway, that was enough. That was the bridge too far.
Right, and it's interesting here that Tom is the one accusing his own mother of racism, and Tom is white, and Aisha is the one who's defending her, Leslie, saying give her a chance.
Yeah, it's something. I think on a personal, emotional level, that betrayal hits closer to home for Tom. I think also it's kind of hinted on at the end of the story that Tom feels a lot of guilt for his wife's death, for Chris's mom's death, that he couldn't protect her. So I think on a personal level that works on Tom. But I also think there's an interesting political level where I think when I take a step back, and I see in the work of white Caucasian writers that they are in some ways more passionate in saying this is racist and that is racist than sort of writers of colors in some ways. And I think part of that is a certain shame of, like, oh, these people are like me and they're thinking these things, where I feel like, I've sometimes seen people of color have a little bit of a more measured response to it, primarily because we've just had to deal with it more, and we've had to deal with how complicated it is. I think we've had experiences where people that we really like and really love say things that we kind of realize maybe that's a little bit racist, but what do you do with that? So I think it echoes both Tom's personal but also sort of a political thing. Having said that, though, the opposite of what I say is true as well. there's definitely a lot of people of color who are way more knee-jerk about issues of racism than like Caucasian people. So it was just something. It was something to explore through the character of Tom.
Well, you've got all this ambiguity in these in the ghosts or spirits. You've got that ambiguity, and there's a lot of ambiguity. There's almost more ambiguity in the humans. I mean, we don't even really know the guy who was keeping bombs in the crates in the hallway. We don't really even see much of who he was. It's somebody else who winds up setting off those bombs, which seems like an important plot point.
Yeah. And again, I think that's one of the places where the tropes of horror, ended up lending itself so well to tell a story like this. So much of horror is, we're scared of the uncertain, and so keeping things uncertain adds that sense of tension and fear, and and again that goes the same with xenophobia. I think everything would be a lot easier, and the story wouldn't have any teeth. We would strip the story of its teeth, but we'd also strip the fear in society if we actually kind of knew 100% where everyone sat on things. But the fact that we don't, the fact that we only know one perspective of the world at any time, that leads to this sense of unease and doubt and fear.
And visually, there are also different art styles to denote flashbacks and different points of view in there. How did you come up with that as a device?
Honestly, I don't know if I would have if I wasn't working with Aaron. I mean, I've told this story before. So the thing about Aaron that I love, it took me a minute to love it though, is that that he changes his art style, sometimes subtly, sometimes more drastically, sort of every new project that he works on. It's part of his growth as an artist and something I really respect a lot. But when you're working for the first time and the guy you're working with says, "Oh, that thing that you like that made you want to work with me, I'm not doing any of that." You're like, having it. But then it came out looking awesome. And so then when it was just like, all right, well, this guy can do so much, it's kind of funny. He hasn't really had the chance to do all this in the same work. It's kind of like you kind of had to follow Aaron's career to know how versatile he was as an artist. So that's when I had I've got this great, I've got this goose that lays the golden egg. Let's have a chance to put let's start spending these eggs, for lack of a better analogy. And I just started giving him opportunities to sort of mix up artistic styles in the book.
Yeah. Well, I went to great lengths to create a justification for my experimentation. We'll say so. But
some heated discussions going on at some point.
Well, no, I mean, just in the sense of how I ultimately kind of explain the techniques that I used and why I used them. So now, at the end of the day, I did create a theme, which I stuck to. There are rules to what techniques I use when. In the book, but that gave me a lot of latitude to do what I had been wanting to do for a very long time, which was experiment with media and technique. And the arc of my career, I began, the very first book I did was completely digital, and at the end of that, I hated the entire process of doing that. And this was 10 years ago at this point, and at that time, the Photoshop technology was really not where it is today. So the quality of line always looked very contrived and digital to me. And so after that, I went to this technique where I would do my pencils digitally, and then I would print those out in non-repro blue, and then I would ink over top of that. And so I would have sort of the best of both worlds. And then the last project I worked on before Infidel, I had discovered that, suddenly Photoshop brushes could all but imitate natural process. And so I went back to that completely digital, and it really sped my process up. But after that, too, I was still hankering to get into some real weird stuff. And so what I came up with in terms of my justification for this is that everything that is supernatural is traditional media. Everything that is in the real world is digital. Flashbacks, I kind of had a little more play with. Like, there is the flashback at the beginning of issue 3, I think, which is drawn in a completely different style, like a very cartoon child's kind of like cartoon style. And that was like as an homage to Persepolis. And I wanted to just kind of play with something different, and I thought it would be, it would be indicative of the mind of a child, of remembering back to these halcyon days, this relationship between the two of them, which at the time would have been incredibly intimate, incredibly, insulated between the two of them. That was their comfort zone when the two of them, when Aisha and Medina could be just close, tight-knit friends, crying on each other's shoulders in the brambles or wherever it was that they could find, this wooded space in New York. So, but like going back to the main dichotomy is there's a line that exists, like this wall that people put up, which is that wall that's created by hate, which keeps people separate from each other. It keeps them from empathizing. It keeps them from engaging. It keeps them from understanding one another. And that's where you end up with xenophobia and hate and fear and all these things. And so I said to myself, well, that makes perfect sense. The boundary line between the digital real world and the traditional supernatural is that wall, that imaginary wall of hate. You see it, like you can see it, and you can identify what is on either side of that wall, but the wall itself is invisible and really non-existent, and it's a contrivance.
A lot of the spirits, the ghosts in here, they do look different from everything surrounding them. There's almost the coloring makes a big difference as well. There's a luminescence to them. Yeah, as opposed to their surroundings as well.
Yeah, and of course that was Jose taking my notion and then ramping it up, to like really accentuate that divide.
And this might be a weird question. Are you a King Crimson fan at all?
King Crimson? No, not really, actually.
Okay. Because
I would say I'm ambivalent. I have no real opinion. It's just not, it was never kind of in my experience.
Because there's that one image at the end of issue 3 when a demon appears in this form of a giant red face, and it looks like the cover of King Crimson's in the Court of the Crimson King to me, and that was my soundtrack for as long as I kept reading the book after I saw that face. That's what I was hearing in my head.
Huh. I will have to look that up because I can't picture that album cover in my head. That's interesting. I've gotten a lot of like comparisons. Some people have said they see a lot of influence from Scary Stories to Tell the Start, Dark Stephen Gamble, and that was not an intention, but once it was said, I was like, oh, wow, I bet I have been channeling him, because that was the book that Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark was the book that kind of told me that as a child that horror is a thing that you can indulge in, even as a kid. And so I became like utterly fascinated by, anything dark and gruesome and horrifying. From then on, I always sought it out. If there was a rumor that there was an old abandoned house that was haunted, I would go find it.
There are picture books of these kinds of things too. There's one, I'm forgetting the name of the photographer. It's called Abandoned Planet. This guy finds. I love these sorts of things. He finds abandoned houses and theme parks all over the world, and takes these beautiful and haunting photos of them. I would suggest looking it up if that's your thing.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. I love that stuff. Anything that hints at the other, something beyond our realm of experience, something mysterious, something dark, lost, forgotten, covered up for some purpose. I'm very intrigued by all of that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Oh, no, I just want to circle back to something that Aaron said in terms of like the rules and the justification for all that sort of stuff. Like, I think it's part of Aaron just being such a professional that he is, that he doesn't want to experiment for experiment's sake, and he's so self-conscious of it. But like in that opening of issue 3 that he mentioned, where he does it in the Persepolis style, if I'm not mistaken, and I'm pretty sure I'm right about this, originally that was just written of like, do it in a different style. And it was Aaron who kind of came up with the justification of, well, hey, can he, I don't think I originally had this idea, but it was Aaron that said, hey, can she have like this little like cartoon, a little drawing that she's looking at reminds her of this thing that happened, of something that gave her kids, and that justifies the artistic weird scene. And that was all, and again, that was all from Aaron, and that was something like, it's a different scene, it's a memory, like it can be whatever we want. But that was part of Aaron's just like not wanting to experiment for experiment's sake, but to always make sure it's like pushing the story forward and into the character.
Well, it's that classic storytelling rule. If a gun shows up in the first act, you better use it by the third. So if I'm going to use a style, there's got to be a reason, especially when it's like there's just 3 pages of it in the entire book, and it never. Well, I used it again at the very end in the epilogue. Yeah. But at that time, I was like, God, I had this idea, and that's when I totally forgot about that. Pornsak, I told him I wanted to do that, and he couldn't figure out how to make it work in the story, and then I was like, hey, what if after that day, after the day that this happened, they're in class and they're sitting next to each other in like 2nd or 3rd grade, and they, have this kind of understanding, this like secret that connects them even deeper now. And so Aisha, just to cheer up Medina, does a little scribble, up in the margin of her notebook, and then tears it out, and it's just this little child's drawing in crayon that says, best friends forever, and then like folded it up and gave it to Medina, and then Medina tucked it away, and like it became this token, this remembrance, this thing that she could always have and go back to for comfort. And so Aisha didn't even know, like that, this is like all my headcanon. Like Aisha doesn't even know, and Medina has been carrying that little drawing folded up real tight inside her wallet or her purse or wherever for her entire life now. And so that was the idea, that as we come out of that memory, we find ourselves in the hospital, and you realize that whole time Medina had been remembering that moment through the lens of that little drawing that Aisha had made her years ago.
Well, that brings up an interesting point about collaborating on a graphic novel, because it seems like for people who haven't done it, it seems like this mysterious alchemy. How do you write this without images, and how do you push this thing forward together as writer and artist? What's the?
I mean, I'm a very big believer of, the script is a starting point. There are certain pieces of the script that are sacrosanct, and there are certain pieces of the script that are suggestions, and you kind of work forward from there. And I think the thing that I wish more publishers did, speaking as someone who used to work for a publisher, I wish they more did, and I understand why they don't, because it slows the process down. But part of it is having sure the writer is in the loop on all the stages of it. So I'll write something, and in every script I have, and it definitely was on my scripts to Aaron, it was like, these are just suggestions. If you have a better idea, hit me with a better idea, especially with something like horror. An artist, you can describe, and I can see, and I can like point to a book where like this was like scariest thing in the world, but if an artist can't draw it, the artist can't draw it. And so a lot of times you got to be like, this is what I'm thinking, this is what I'm going for, and I can be very specific, but also kind of like, but if you got something better, like shoot me. I'd love to see it. And that happens with storytelling as well. And so, so that happens, you get the layouts in, and I weigh in on layouts, and I say, this is great, that's great, this isn't what communicating what I want, and all that. And that kind of happens like in every step of the process. And then, and one of the big things I do is that when all the art is done, I do kind of a new lettering draft where I go in with all the dialogue and just really make sure it works with what the art is. And sometimes that's the funnest part of the process. It's so fun that you can use it to procrastinate, where you're just like, I don't know if that line is exactly that facial expression. And next thing you know, like 20 minutes of your life is gone. But a lot of that is just sort of that give and take, and also giving, like, Aaron the give and take, because he's got such great instincts of being kind of like, listen, like, if he comes back to me and says, like, this isn't working, I will listen to that, and I will figure out, let's figure out a way that will work, because if you're not feeling it, then something's wrong, and you're the one who has to execute it.
Yeah. I mean, we were spoiled in the sense that we had a lot of time to do this, so we had that leeway in the schedule to be able to have 3-hour conversations, every few days,
Well, this was done before you presented it to Image, correct?
No. What we did was we did an 8-page sample. I had written the script of the first issue. The synopsis of the story was done. We sent them an 8-page sample, and then only after Image greenlit it did we work on the book. But that said, Image has the policy of they don't want to solicit books until you have 3 issues in the can, which is actually, on the one hand, it's frustrating in the sense of, like, I just want this thing to be seen to the world, but actually it really is good for the work itself, because it gives you a chance to really, really hone in on what it is and get your process going. And then once it's live, once it's solicited, you're kind of on rails.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it is, you mentioned in the biographical information, a creator-owned book. For those unfamiliar with the term, what's the definition of that, and what does it mean in terms of the final product?
Ooh, that's interesting. I feel like, it's funny. Creator-owned means a lot of different things. There was a day where, and I've had writers tell me this before at Vertigo, but creator-owned wasn't really creator-owned because DC owned it and blah, 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 blah. But now we're at this stage where creator-owned really can mean creator-owned, where at least at Image, like me and Aaron, own what to do with the book. Like the publishing rights are with Image. And I guess by our contract they could do whatever they want with it, but I'm pretty sure they have to consult us first. But like, in terms of the story and the IP beyond that, it's all up to us whether to do or not do as we please. And that's not working in other places. Yeah,
and it's every company's creator-owned contract is completely different. So, I mean, when Pornsak says there's a lot of, like, that's not a hard and fast term. It just means somewhere in that the people who created the book retain some amount of creative rights over it. So if it goes and becomes a movie or becomes a TV show or turns into a video game or becomes toys or whatever, the creators retain creative control or certain amount of creative control and, get a certain percentage of what money is made off of those future things. So Image obviously has like the most, like the creators retain the most rights. But because of that, it also means like the sort of financial onus on being able to like live while you create that book is on you, because they're not going to pay you a page rate. They're not going to fund the book or give you an advance or anything like that. So, I mean, from the time you start writing the book until the time that first issue gets released to the time that they collect the money on that book and then distribute those royalties can be a year or more. So this was, this is another thing I talk to people a lot about. Creator owned, I always said, is either a young man or like a young person or an old person's game. Young because you're just getting started, you don't have a lot of bills, you can probably still live at home. Or old because you have already done so much work already that you're getting royalties from all over the place, so you can kind of afford not to have that direct kind of income from the pages you're doing right now coming in. Mm-hmm. So for me, it was a perfect situation because Pornsak was able to fund the book as we went through the process. So it was, if it wasn't for that, I would not have been able to do the book.
And the movie rights have been sold, correct? Or do I have that wrong?
Yes.
It's over at TriStar Pictures with Sugar 23. The director attaches Honey Abu Assad, who directed Paradise Now, and Omar, who was also great. The writers are Juliet Snowden and Styles White.
Mm-hmm. That's got to be. I talked to Nathan Ballingrud about this a couple of episodes ago. That some of his stories have been optioned for movies and TV shows. It must be thrilling and terrifying at the same time, because what happens with your work now, and how involved do you get to be on this very visual, this very upfront interpretation of your work?
It is and it isn't. I think it depends on how the mindset you have kind of going into it. I mean, the way I feel about it is that I said everything I wanted to say with these characters and the story in the book itself. So I don't have to. So I don't need a movie to come along to say more or anything like that. It's a, in a weird way, it's kind of like I built this great house, but now I sold the house. I don't really keep up to date with what the tenants are doing in the building, kind of thing. That said, the people sort of I sent it to seem to be great people, and I'm super excited to see what they do. But I don't know if I really have anxiety. I mean, I guess the only anxiety that I have is if it becomes one of those things where they're like, oh, they did this, and it was super offensive, and then I'm like, it's going to get killed by association or something like that. But I think everyone involved is too smart and too empathetic to ever let that happen. And I've met a lot of the people, specifically at Sugar and at TriStar, and they're such wonderful people, and they really do get the material that I have a lot of faith that that's not going to happen. So, I kind of like this part of the process in the sense that, like, now it's my turn to kind of be surprised. Did the book because there were questions that meant a lot to me, and now I get to see how other people interpret those same questions. And that's that kind of call and response is one of the reasons why I made the book in the first place.
Well, you started out as an editor, so you're sort of familiar with the process of working and caring for somebody else's work.
Yeah.
So how did you go from that to this? How did you decide this was where you were going to jump into writing?
God. Well, my path was kind of like I was a comic editor. Then DC, Jeff Johns kind of recruited me to be part of a think tank to bring comics into other media. So I had that experience as well. And so I oversaw and I ran. I started and then later oversaw DC's television department. And it's sort of like from the Arrowverse on up. So I had a lot of experience of watching adaptations and seeing the give and take, and how if you're too clingy, a lot of times these adaptations don't work. And then, as I was doing that, I just I started off wanting to be a writer, and comics and editing comics was so fulfilling. It kept me away from it. But then the problem with being a TV exec is that you're not as in the trenches as you are editing a comic. And that distance was a little too great for me, and so it was time for me to come back to writing. So, and then I just started writing my two loves, which was comics and TV, and that would eventually lead me back to Infidel.
Mm-hmm. And now you're working on something that's coming out this summer, 2-sentence horror stories?
Yes, I have 2-sentence horror. That actually, it's funny, that was something I worked on, I think, last year, or maybe a year before. No, last year was about right. And then, but 2-sentence horror stories is coming out in August. I'm looking forward to that. I wrote on season 2 of Light as a Feather for Hulu. The trailer just dropped, and I think that comes out like end of the month. Mm-hmm. Which is more horror. It's like teen horror. It's Pretty Little Liars with horror, and it's like two of my favorite things. So I got to play with that for a little bit. But I'm also very much do some more stuff in comments, which unfortunately I can't talk about. I feel like it's the most being like, can't talk about this, I can't talk about that.
Yeah.
I get that a lot. I get that sometimes when my day job is mostly interviewing comedians for the Boston Globe and some other places, and sometimes people are working on a pilot, and I'll have 10 questions, and it's the bulk of the interview, and I'll say, well, so what about this? And they'll say, I don't even want to talk about it because I'll jinx it. So now I wind up talking about, so how's your kid?
Right.
Yeah,
so I've been doing that for months now. I'll tell people, and they're like, "Oh, congratulations! Things are really turning. Like things are coming up Campbell now." And I'm like, "Shh, quiet! Like don't even." I'm like, "Let me find the nearest piece of wood."
Well, with that in mind, what do you want to say about what you have coming up?
Me, I can finally actually talk about it. They just announced it next Tuesday. But I'm bringing John Constantine Hellblazer back at DC. So he has been out Hellblazer, which was the longest running comic title at Vertigo. I think it was like 25, 26 years. Mm-hmm. It was ended in 2013 at issue 300. And since then, Constantine has, kind of popped up, here and there. They attempted to bring him into the DCU proper with DC Rebirth. And that, I can't remember how long. It didn't last too long. So, and they gave him a lot of new kind of like superpowers and to get him kind of, rolled in with the rest of the superhero gang. Mm-hmm. And, I don't know if that really went over too well with the hardcore, Hellblazer fans, because John Constantine is such a loner, and his particular type of magic has always been so subtle. And most issues, he doesn't even do magic. He just kind of fumbles his way through a situation based on grit and instinct and wit. So that's what is happening now. We are bringing Hellblazer back. We're bringing Constantine back to his roots. The promo art that they had me do, they asked me like specifically like make sure like in the graffiti on the wall that you put in like a 301 to kind of give a nod to like we're going back to our roots. And so it's written by Cy Spurrier, who is the current writer for The Dreaming. And it's going to be part of the Sandman universe. Mm-hmm. It's coming out, I think issue 1 is due to come out on November 27th, and there's going to be a one-shot prequel. So the series proper, which is what I'm going to be the primary artist for, is Hellblazer. There's going to be a one-shot, which is going to introduce him, sort of reintroduce him to the world. Called John Constantine Hellblazer, which is a nod to the original series, which was always called John Constantine Hellblazer. Mm-hmm. And then there's 4 other Sandman Universe titles. There's The Dreaming, Lucifer, House of Whispers, and Books of Magic. And each one of those is going to have a little nod to Constantine coming back. That's his story is going to be kind of wrapped into everyone else's there. And then boom, November 27th hits and the series begins proper. And so it's going to be, it's really exciting. I'm still like over the moon.
I'm not sure that companies always know how to integrate their occult universes in with the rest of what they do. Mm-hmm. That always seems like a problem. It seems like, I guess, Swamp Thing's already gone from the DC universe in terms of the TV show.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. I think that's, and I haven't seen it yet. I heard it's amazing. But
it's tough, and I actually think out of anyone, it's funny because like these magic universes are so hard. And but I actually think DC, primarily because of Swamp Thing and Constantine, has one of the more robust magical universe of characters that work, because they are because they are so hard to do, and I think it partly is because of like how Swamp Thing and Constantine kind of like lean into horror.
Yeah, well, Constantine his whole story is so wrapped up in the war between heaven and hell, and he deals with demons and elementals and fae. So, which doesn't, like, Darkseid doesn't quite fit in that, or Batman for that matter, or Superman. And, when he works his way out of a jam, it's because he was able to pull a fast one on a demon, or just know some little piece of information that just happened to work out in that moment. And it's really rare that he actually does any kind of magic, like I was saying before. And if he does, it's tragedy after tragedy for him. And so it's much quieter stories, it's much more intimate stories. He's not a bombastic character. He's incredibly introspective. Mm-hmm. He's incredibly distant. So, there's some parallels obviously between his mentality and Batman's, but he really is an individual apart. And so, he was brought into the Sandman universe back in the early 90s by Neil Gaiman with the original Books of Magic miniseries. And so, it was, now it's kind of, they're bringing him into it proper, and, I don't know, I'm so excited to see where this goes. It's this is, such a huge deal. And I made this comment on Twitter the day that it was announced last week that, 6 or 7 years ago, I can't remember exactly when it was when I did my very first Vertigo work. And it was just a little 6-page insert story in an issue of House of Mystery. And then that was mm-hmm. it. This is the first time me coming back to Vertigo was now. And I managed to just squeeze in right at the end and get an issue, get some work in on Lucifer. And I've done a one-shot issue in another issue of the Sandman universe, which has not been announced, so I can't say that. But but that was it. But sort of in the back of my head, and I said this on Twitter too, I never really said this aloud to anyone, but I just kind of clocked it away. I just kind of logged it away back in the back of my head, which was, one day I'm going to draw John Constantine. Mm-hmm. I never went past that. I never said to myself, this is how I'm going to do it. But just having that thought in the back of my head kind of started to kind of redirect my work and my style and my path. And mm-hmm. Infidel was the thing that really triggered that and took me full steam into the horror. And it's really incredible. You can just kind of put it, file a thought away and then just kind of slowly work towards that as a kind of guiding principle. And then boom, it manifests. It's crazy.
It occurs to me that I would like to see you guys pair up again to work on one of my favorite characters that nobody ever seems to know how to keep a series going with, and that's the Spectre.
Ooh, that's an
based on Infidel, I could really see you guys digging in to that character. Because I know it's hard to deal with a character who is the living embodiment of God's vengeance on Earth. That's not quite the same thing as, hey, I got launched from a different planet, and now because of this, the sun's a different color. I can beat people up and fly.
Yeah.
It's a kind of a different thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting one. I'm a big fan of Ostrander's run on that, so that's definitely really interesting.
Gotham by Midnight I thought was great, and I really wish they'd kept with Ben Templesmith. I forget the artist who replaced him.
Okay.
And nothing against the artist who replaced him, but man, was he good for that character. So I'll just end with this. Where's the best way for people to find out about what you've got coming up and what you're up to?
Probably Twitter. For me, it's real_Pornsak at Twitter. I'm also on Instagram at real_Psak because I don't think you say porn on Instagram. And the show Light as a Feather Season 2 that premieres on Friday, July 26th on Hulu, and Two Sentence Horror Stories on the CW premieres August 8th at 9 p.m. And so we'll see if there's a difference between the show that gets streamed and the show that gets watched the old-fashioned way. But that's where I'm at.
Yeah. I don't keep up too well on Instagram. I am attempting to change that. But you can find me there. It's Aaron Campbell Arts, plural. And then on Twitter, I am at Old Man Campbell, like old man, but no D. So, because I had one letter too short, I couldn't say old man, but I always say old man anyway. But so at Old Man Campbell, I'm fairly active, especially recently with the Hellblazer announcement. The fan base for Hellblazer is like incredibly energized, so I'm trying to stay kind of as connected as possible to them as I go forward. So there's that. Of course, there's Facebook, which I'm fairly active on. And you can just do a search for my name on that. And then if you want to see my very first Vertigo work, that came out in Lucifer number 8. I did 15 pages in that. You will have to guess at which pages I did because it's not labeled. And then, like I said, the first issue of Hellblazer is supposed to hit this fall on the 27th of November.
Great. Well, thank you guys for doing this. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Seriously, this is fun.
Thanks again to Pornsak Pichetshote and Aaron Campbell for speaking with me about Infidel and more. Infidel is published by Image Comics, and you can find that at www.imagecomics.com and at booksellers and comic shops everywhere. Follow Pichetshote on Twitter under @real_Pornsak and Campbell under @oldmancampbell, and that's @OLMAN Campbell. And if you're a fan of this or any other episode of the Department of Tangents podcast, please consider subscribing and or leaving us a positive review or rating on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Radio Public, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find the podcast on YouTube and Spotify, and check out videos, essays, reviews, and other content on the blog at www.departmentoftangents.com. This week's featured track is a song I heard just the day before I put this episode together, but it fits perfectly with the themes in Infidel. The song is So Say We All from Landroid's upcoming album Imperial Dunes, which is coming out September 13th. Landroid is the duo of Cooper Gillespie, who sings and plays guitar and bass, and Greg Gordon, who handles drums and sequencing. In the press release, Gillespie identified the inspiration for the song, which is the opening track on the album. So Say We All was written in reaction to the current political climate where immigrants are demonized, she says. The message is that there is no such thing as race. We all belong to one race, the human race. Not only does that message fit with Infidel, so does the music with its dark, throbbing synth backbone and dreamlike lighter strings and keys floating over the top. Find out more about Landroid and pre-order Imperial Dunes at landroid.bandcamp.com. This is So Say We All by Landroid.
Dear Young.